Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for the third in our series of Science and Democracy Hangouts. My name is Deborah Balin. I am an analyst with the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Our featured speaker today is Dan Sarewitz. And to introduce Dan today, we have Andrew Rosenberg, who's the director of the Center for Science and Democracy, and he will also introduce a live group that we have joining for the Q&A at Stanford University. So Andy, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much, Deborah. It's a pleasure to have this third Science and Democracy Hangout. Our speaker today is Daniel Sarewitz. He's the co-director of the Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes at Arizona State University, professor of Science and Society at the university. Dan's work focuses on revealing connections between science, policy decisions, scientific research, and social outcomes, or if you like, how the distribution of social benefits of science relate to the way we organize scientific inquiry. That topic, of course, is very important to the program that I lead, the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Our goal is to advance the role of science in public policy and democratic dialogue. The program here, the Center for Science and Democracy, is 2 years old. We're also joined by my colleague Peter Frumhoff, who's the chief scientist for the Union of Concerned Scientists. He is at Stanford with a group of graduate students at Stanford. Peter, can you say anything, or are you saying anything at this point?
Well, we can just welcome all the folks here from Stanford who come from a range of disciplines and academic departments to engage in this dialogue. So we're looking forward to it.
Dan Sarowitz's topic is uncertainty, politics, and technology. We just saw some of the uncertainty and technology trying to get this thing up and running, but I'm not sure that's exactly what he's going to talk about. I think he's speaking more broadly about the use of uncertainty and the perception of uncertainty in our society with regard to science and technology. So Dan, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, well, ironically, or not, one of the places my talk ends up going is to suggest that technology has certain interesting roles in helping to overcome uncertainty, but I think our experience today suggests that technology can create a lot of uncertainty. Peter, nice to see you. So let me, I guess, how much time do we have now? About 50 minutes more?
Yes, about
Okay.
50 minutes.
All right, so I'm going to kind of sail through a kind of conceptual approach to thinking about uncertainty, and hopefully do it with enough clarity that we can then have a discussion around it. And I'll mostly do it through telling a few stories about science, politics, uncertainty, democracy that are aimed at illustrating a couple of key points. And I think that the big point that I really want to emphasize is I think we tend, especially as scientists, to think about uncertainty as something out there in nature that as scientists we try to get our heads around and reduce, the goal being more understanding that's reliable and predictably robust about the world that allows us then to take more effective actions. And I'm going to suggest that I think in the world that many of us who are inhabiting this kind of messy space of science and politics, in that world that uncertainty is actually something very different indeed. And that it's much more a state of mind than a state of nature. And it's much more a phenomenon of the political, the interactions between science and politics than it is of the efforts of scientists to come to terms with complex phenomena. And I want to be clear that I'm not being metaphorical here. I'm actually being quite literal. I think understanding uncertainty in these contested areas of science and politics is something different than when we're simply thinking about science in the laboratory or science to help inform engineering. I'll I guess frame it by saying that the standard way we think about science as the pursuit of reliable knowledge through testing hypotheses and engaging in exercises of replicability and falsifiability and the exercises of peer review to try to ensure that the community is engaged in this kind of truth-making endeavor or this knowledge-making endeavor. I think that way of thinking about science doesn't apply very much to the way we need to think about science when we're talking about contested political domains. To illustrate that point, I'm gonna talk about something that's not a contested political domain but could have been. And I think this story that I'm going to tell you reveals a different way of thinking about uncertainty. So for those of you at Stanford, this is particularly relevant because it's a story about the San Andreas Fault, and which of course runs most of the length of California, and throughout its history has led to considerable disaster and mayhem in San Francisco when it ruptures at times that are largely unpredictable. And in places that are largely unpredictable. But it turns out that there was a time in the late 1970s and early 1980s when there was a high degree of confidence that the behavior of the San Andreas Fault could be predicted in a particular segment called the Parkfield segment of the San Andreas. And seismologists working in that area had discovered a very strong periodicity around earthquake ruptures on the Parkfield segment of the San Andreas Fault, periodicity of about every 22 years. And they issued a formal prediction, and the formal prediction was that in a 5-year period from 1988 to 1993, there was a 95% chance of a rupture at a moderate-sized earthquake, 6.2, along the Parkfield segment. And what I want to emphasize here is that this was not casually done. This was a result of many years of research. It led to a big monitoring program around the Parkfield segment of the fault. And crucially, for my purposes, it was very highly vetted. So it went through peer review. The prediction was published in Science magazine. So we know it was very rigorously reviewed, but it was also reviewed in 2 other expert panels, a California State Earthquake Prediction Panel and a National Earthquake Prediction Panel, all of which endorsed this prediction. So, so this is about as highly vetted as science ever gets, and it's also about as certain as science ever gets, 95% certainty. Now, as it turns out, the earthquake did not occur during this period. It arguably occurred around 2004, I believe, so much, much later, way outside any even 2 or 3 sigma window of probability. And the question is, what does that 95% uncertainty mean? Does it simply mean that, well, okay, 1 out of 20 times or thereabouts, you won't get an earthquake, and this happened to be this seismologist's unlucky day, or something else going on? And what I want to suggest is there's something else going on, and that something else has to do with the way that we think about and make assertions of uncertainty. Because it turns out that after the earthquake failed to materialize during the predicted window, scientists went back, seismologists went back, did some additional studies of the data, did some additional field research, found some other data points of ruptures that didn't fit into the 22-year periodicity pattern, and basically disproved the validity of the prediction. Now, this is pretty interesting because, of course, the science had been highly vetted before that. So the question is what actually happened? Now, is there any way I can engage in a Q&A at this point with at least with the group at Stanford? Is that doable?
This is Deborah. Yes, you can invite them to use the Q&A app, and they will, if they type things in, you will see them in your right-hand bar if you click on the Q&A app in your
okay. So I've clicked on that. Let's see.
And there should be one comment in there already that I see.
Yes. Hey, what are your views on anarchist government in a utopian society in the future? Cool. We'll get to that later.
You could invite people to comment, and then their comments will show up there.
Okay. Cool. All right. So so given that story about the Parkfield prediction, here's what I want to ask. Do you imagine that the Parkfield segment of the San Andreas Fault runs through downtown San Francisco or runs through a rural area south of Stanford?
We don't need to type this in. We can actually respond.
Yeah, we can respond.
Hear you.
Anybody want to jump in? Don't be shy.
You have any intuitions around this?
We heard one rural. Two rurals. I heard close to San Francisco.
Is there a groundswell here for rural?
Another couple. Yeah, we're getting kind of a weighted tendency towards rural.
Why would that be? Why is that your intuition?
Less controversial if it's not a lot of people. Less controversial if there's not a lot of people there.
Yeah, the stakes are very low, right? 6.2 along the Parkfield segment, which is indeed in the rural area of California. You know, it'll make a few cows unhappy and maybe knock down a barn or something. But basically, it's not something that has significant social impact. So now the counterfactual, but I think has strong intuitive appeal, is that had the Parkfield prediction been made for San Francisco, the level of certainty would never have been that high because many more scientists would have been involved. There would have been much more care taken in trying to understand the complexities of it. There would have been all sorts of competing interests, potential winners and losers from the prediction, et cetera. And the later revelations about problems with the data and complexities with the system would have been more likely to have been brought to the fore. So what I want to use that story to suggest is that there's a strong political component to predictions, and in fact, I will assert and have tried to argue a lot more carefully and in detail elsewhere that uncertainty is to a considerable extent a political phenomenon. That is, as political stakes increase, as the contested values around a problem are brought to the fore, as the urgency for taking action increases, uncertainty tends to increase as well. And I think this is not surprising. It's in part a phenomenon of the types of problems we're dealing with, which are problems of complex systems, complex open systems, non-deterministic, where there's many ways of analytically entering them, many ways of understanding them, many types of factual statements one can make about them, but no real way to have an entire view of the whole system, and no real way to have a comprehensive predictive view of the complex behavior of the system. Now, let me switch to another illustrative example to try to illustrate the same idea from a somewhat different perspective. This has to do with the Yucca Mountain Nuclear Waste Repository. And for those of you who are at least vaguely familiar with that, you may know that that at least since the early 1980s, the U.S. has been engaged in trying to characterize the Yucca Mountain site. This is in central Nevada, and it's the site that Congress chose in the mid-1980s to be the to be approved or not, to be certified as the repository for high-level nuclear waste for the U.S. And it's been the job of the Department of Energy to show that the site could be demonstrated to be safe. That is to ensure that there would not be radioactive leaks that could make it into the human environment within a period of 10,000 years, at least at a level that would have potentially harmful impacts. Now, this has, of course, been politically very divisive. Lots of citizens in Nevada have been against it. Many environmental groups have been against it. Scientists have disagreed about it. But I want to just talk about the evolution of one particular aspect of the site certification, scientific aspect of the site certification process, to give you another sense of how uncertainty evolves depending on the context of the uncertainty. So there's a particular measure of hydrologic behavior called percolation flux. That's basically a measurement of how fast a volume of water moves through a particular volume of space over time. And percolation flux is important because if water is moving quickly through the site, and if high-level waste gets out of containment vessels because they corrode, it could be carried into the water table, it could be carried to the surface to other places where it creates exposure that's dangerous for human beings. And so an important part of the site certification at Yucca Mountain has been to show that percolation flux is very low. And indeed, for many years, for about 14 years, between the mid-1980s and mid-1990s, the environmental assessments and the performance assessments, very complex modeling exercises done by the Department of Energy, showed very low percolation fluxes, between 0.1 and 1 millimeter per year, which was sufficient to demonstrate, at least for the hydrology, for the hydrogeology, that Yucca Mountain's behavior would conform to the EPA standard of 10,000 years of safety. In the late mid-1990s, two independent bodies, advisory bodies, one the National Research Council and their board on radioactive waste, and the other the Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board, an independent government body, told DOE that these modeling exercises weren't sufficient, that they actually had to dig a hole, dig a tunnel down to the 1,000-foot level where the site would be, and do some in-situ work. And so they did that, and there was some water at the site, which was not unexpected. And they did isotopic analysis of the water and determined that there was an isotope called chlorine-36 present in the water at the site. Does anybody know anything about chlorine-36? So chlorine-36 is bomb pulse chlorine. That is, it's created from nuclear tests. The nuclear test site for the U.S., the above-ground nuclear test site, was very near the Yucca Mountain site. And so the fact that there was chlorine-36 present in the at the proposed waste site, 1,000 feet below the ground, shows that water traveled from the surface to the waste site in about 50 years. Much faster than the models suggested, indicating a percolation flux of perhaps an order of magnitude higher than what was predicted by the models. Now, if the story ended there, it would we'd say, well, that's a success. Okay, we understand that uncertainty can change as we learn more. Although it's interesting, of course, because the uncertainty in some ways actually increased. But you could say, well, we know science is contingent, and more knowledge allowed us to achieve a more reliable result. And it's good that we actually, driven by these external bodies that forced DOE, pressured DOE to do some additional research, that we got this number that gave us a better result. But the story, oh, and by the way, that 10 millimeter per year number would basically threaten the integrity of the geologic isolation model and would require a revisiting of the validity of the site using that model. Problem is, the plot continues to thicken because, so the results, the isotopic analysis had been done by Los Alamos National Lab, and DOE asked Lawrence Livermore National Lab, the other major U.S. weapons lab, to replicate the science, which of course is what good science is all about. And they did the isotopic analysis, and they decided, they concluded that it was actually contamination, that Los Alamos samples had been contaminated from exposure to the isotope at the surface, and that actually it was not a demonstration of the presence of the Cl-36 at the site. So you had these contradictory results. It's hard to know what to do. Los Alamos was asked to reproduce their work. They did, insisted that in fact the chlorine-36 was not artifactual but was real, was present. Lawrence Livermore again redid their science, insisted that it was contamination. DOE threw up their hands and said, well, we'll have a third party. They asked the University of Nevada, Las Vegas geochemistry lab to do their work, and UNLV did it and said they couldn't tell. So at the end of another 5 years of trying to understand what was going on with chlorine-36, the uncertainty around the problem was even higher. Should we go back and trust the original models, or should we be concerned that chlorine-36 is there, and how should we deal with this? So again, I think this is this is meant simply to illustrate the strong contingency between the science of doing really hard science in open systems where it's very difficult to actually see a signal between causes and effects that is robust, the politics, the incentives, and this leads us to a place where Yucca Mountain remains, on the one hand, the most studied piece of Earth on the planet, and on the other, an area of unresolved politics and unresolved science. And of course, for those of you who aren't familiar with the background politics here, basically, if you're a Republican, you've been in favor of putting nuclear waste there. If you're a Democrat, you've been against it. Not particularly scientifically motivated, but that's how the politics have played out, especially since Harry Reid, the head of the Senate, and one of the most powerful politicians in the country, is a Democrat, and delivering those electoral votes is very important for the Democratic candidate in the 2008 election. Indeed, one of President Obama's first campaign delivery of campaign promises was to reverse the decision made by President Bush to certify the Yucca Mountain site for receiving nuclear waste. So what I'm trying to show with those two stories is that you can't separate the characterization of uncertainty from the political context within which uncertainty is being characterized. And again, I don't mean to say, I mean this to be very literal. I don't mean to say if only we could do better science, if we only could keep the politicians away, if only we could not politicize these problems. I mean to say that in these types of issues, where the public problem and the scientific problem are deeply implicated with one another in these complex, open, non-deterministic systems, the uncertainty is a political phenomenon to a considerable extent. So what does that mean? Well, one thing it means is that trying to solve political problems by reducing scientific uncertainty around policy-relevant questions is a road to continued frustration. And I think we see that on many of the issues that many of us are familiar with and that UCS is intimately involved in. And I think that suggests that one might want to sometimes take a step back from some of these questions and think about and problems and think about, okay, if the problem isn't one of reducing uncertainty, what is the problem? And so what I'm going to do now is quickly talk through two other examples of successes in dealing with a highly contested science in highly uncertain domains that can point towards a different way of thinking about how one politically can navigate these sorts of problems and not have the science become hostage to the political process. So quickly, I think I'm going to try to just do this in 5 minutes, and then we can talk so we can get to conversation. But if one compares how Sweden has dealt with nuclear waste to how the U.S. has dealt with it, they've actually reversed the process. In the U.S., we did the politics first, chose the site, and then asked the scientists to show whether the site would be any good or not. In Sweden, they started out that way, but once they saw that there was lots of political opposition, they actually went to a different system where they chose a number of possible sites, and then they asked the municipalities that hosted those sites whether they were willing to volunteer for further assessment. And the process was very transparent, and it was also voluntaristic, and the municipalities were told that they could back out at any time during the process. And it was also made clear that the site that would be chosen for the nuclear waste repository would get a significant economic reward, but so would any sites that weren't chosen, especially finalists, technical finalists. So in Sweden, they narrowed the possibilities to, I think, about a half a dozen sites that were deemed technically plausible. They asked which municipalities were willing to volunteer. 3 agreed through, I believe, through votes that they would volunteer for further assessments. 1 of them then ended up backing out. They decided that they actually didn't want to be considered. 2 were assessed technically through final stages, and 1 municipality was chosen. Both got their rewards, and at this point, at least, it looks like that process has worked. And again, we're left with a counterfactual. The counterfactual is, would that have worked if that 1 town had been chosen through a more centralized process, told that they were going to be the site, and then the science was done to try to demonstrate that. And my the argument I'd like to make here is that at least it seems pretty satisfying to think that by solving the democratic problem first, the scientific problem becomes much less contested, because you no longer have a whole set of interests around opposing the site that you would have had if they had used the U.S. model. So in other words, by first solving the political problem, the question of uncertainty around the technical attributes of the site in Sweden becomes significantly less important than they have been in the U.S. I'll give you another example from a completely different domain. This is from the regulation of toxic wastes, of toxic chemicals. Anyone who's familiar with toxic chemical regulation in this country is aware that we basically haven't succeeded in doing anything except enriching lawyers, and that of a possible probably 15,000 chemicals that are potentially toxic, we've managed to regulate something around 5 of them, because we end up continually arguing about the science and the uncertainties around the risk assessments of the chemicals. I spent a year working with a group at University of Massachusetts Lowell Toxic Use Reduction Institute, which focuses on a very different model, not on doing cost-benefit analysis, but on working with firms in Massachusetts to find alternative chemicals for those that are thought to be toxic, but where the legal battles have not been resolved, and to replace those chemicals that are thought to be toxic with chemicals for which one has a reasonable amount of confidence that they'd be safer. Either they don't bioaccumulate, or they are water soluble, biodegradable, or sometimes even can be replaced with totally different processes. And they've had remarkable success on the chemicals that they focused on, around things like solvents for cleaning industrial sites, dry cleaning, a couple of other examples. And this process has come not through the scientific process of demonstrating risk and imposing regulation, but on demonstrating that a plausibly toxic chemical can be replaced with a plausibly less toxic chemical at not much cost, that allows the private sector actors to continue to do what they do, that keeps workers employed, that ensures business models, and so on. And this came about through a creative piece of legislation in Massachusetts called the Toxic Use Reduction Act, that basically enabled this framework. And so what I want to suggest with both the toxics example from Massachusetts and the nuclear waste example from Sweden is that where you see these interesting successes, what you see is not an effort to make the science do more work in terms of compelling political action. What you see is, in fact, quite the opposite. You see creative political solutions that then ask less of the science, but more of the politics, and in ways that have allowed progress. And I guess I'll kind of stop there, except to summarize a couple of the lessons, the more broad lessons of these types of examples. And there are certainly more that I could present, but these are the ones that I like best. So one is that we shouldn't expect science to do the job of politics, and that often when we prescribe more research to reduce uncertainty, basically what we're saying is if the science is more certain, then the politicians will converge on a solution. And I think empirically we can see that that really often doesn't work out that way, and often, in fact, the controversies get worse over time. Second, I think it's important to realize that trust is more important than certainty. And trust is built through open political processes. It's built by inclusiveness and transparency. It's not built by insistence that the science tells you something. So political pathways that focus on trust and inclusiveness rather than scientific pathways that focus on trying to reduce, I think fruitlessly often, to reduce uncertainty are potentially more fruitful. A third point is that it's the search for options, technological options, as in the case of alternative chemicals, political options, as is in the case of the Swedish nuclear waste example, is a more fruitful political pathway than the search for more certain science. And then finally, let me just get to my notes here so I remember, that it's actually important not to expect and demand a significant changes in ways of life and social patterns. That the minute you begin to say that I'm connecting the science to a political prescription that demands that, for example, you give up your job, you give up your profits, you change your understanding of your role in the world, you create huge potential political hurdles. And that it's possible, in some cases, not in all, but it's possible in some cases to imagine, if you're creative about it, different ways of framing problems that allows people to maintain their ways of life, allows them to maintain their existing social patterns, and therefore keeps the politics more at bay and asks less of the science, but instead focuses on options that allow progress to be made. So I'll stop there and now open it up for conversation.
Thank you very much, Dan. Peter, do you want to sort of manage the questions from Stanford? Or?
Sure, Andy. So we have got questions both typed in, and also I'm sure we'll have some here at Stanford. Dan, why don't you start with any of the questions you want to turn to that are on the chat screen?
Okay. So I'll just start at the bottom. So I don't know if this is the last one or the first one. So the question is, if uncertainty is social, does that mean that scientists don't have a role in resolving it in the public realm? So I'd say that when we are in the midst of these highly contested battles that are at root political, I actually think that's right. I think that that the effort the efforts to resolve these scientific debates by reducing scientific uncertainty that is then supposed to compel action, I think there's strong reason to think that that's a lose-lose, and that it often ends up simply reinforcing the political debate and making the science look much more political than I think is healthy for either science or democracy. Let me see if I can find something that's a little different than that one. Oh, there's the question about anarchist government in a utopian society, but I think that's above my pay grade. All right, here's a good one. How can early career scientists make sure that science gets a seat at the table in policy discussions without making people think we're saying science should be the only factor we should take into account? So I mean, I think science has a seat at the table. The problem is it the right seat at the right table? You know, one of the dilemmas here, of course, is everyone wants the science on their side, right? And the reason is that we have this strong sense as modern rational people that we want to act rationally, and that acting rationally means that what we do is consistent with what science tells us. And so sometimes I actually think that the difficulty is how do we say at certain points, look, this is no longer a question that can be resolved by resort to scientific debate. We need to back off and be clear about what the underlying value disputes are. Because until we're clear about those value disputes, we can't really be clear about what the political options are. and why it is that we're having these arguments. So I'm gonna answer that question by suggesting kind of an alternative way to think about it, which is when should science be at the table, and when it's at the table, what should its appropriate role be? It is a standard trick of Congress to get scientists on either side of an issue at a hearing to back up one position or another in ways that often makes it look like the science is simply politics by another means. So I think it's difficult to resist that temptation. Another temptation that's difficult to resist is if resources are available to do research on a contested problem, as scientists, we want to do it. So, for example, when chemicals become subjects of concern or controversy, often Environmental Protection Agency will provide research for doing risk assessments on those chemicals. Now, we know as an empirical matter that simply does not lead to effective political solutions or policy solutions in most cases. So, it would be really interesting to me to hear cases where the scientific community would actually, or leaders of the scientific community in particular areas would actually say, look, this isn't about us at this point. We've provided broad boundaries around the issue. There are clearly uncertainties here, but what's underlying this is a question of interests and values and the kind of world that we want to have, and let's have that discussion instead of an argument about uncertainty.
Great. Well, let's open it up to folks here at Stanford. The floor is yours. Anybody want to weigh in with a question? Everyone, go ahead. What's your name?
I'm Nikola Uliwari, and I'm a PhD.
Sounds kind of bad. I think maybe if you could come closer to the table, because Peter, I could hear you, but I can't. I think there must be some distortion. Thanks.
Let's see. So I'm Nikola Uliwari, and I'm a PhD student in Environment and Resources here. And I was wondering, I very much agree with your statement that it's important to build a transparent and build trust in the process, as more so than, maybe not more so, but in addition to creating more certain scientific information. But I feel like that works really when you're working at a small scale, when you're thinking about production of chemicals in Massachusetts, as opposed to thinking about policies that are happening at the national or international scale. And I think that I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about ways that you see to build trust when you're thinking about national scale or even international politics.
Yeah, I don't see any scale issues here. And let me just say, I don't want to be glib about that this is easy to do, but I do think that we're at a point where we can have should have learned from some of the problems of the last 20 years as society becomes more complicated, as we have more of these issues that implicate politics and science, often at the national or global scale. So I don't see any obstacles to being more inclusive. And I think, I think Sweden is a case where, at a national level, it was done. In the U.S., in the nuclear waste example, we actually did have multiple sites early on. What Congress did was they quickly reduced the options from about a half a dozen to 3. There was one in Texas, one in Washington, and one in Nevada. At that time, it turned out that the Speaker of the House was from Washington and the President of the Senate was from Texas. And so guess what? Nevada got chosen because it didn't have a particularly powerful political coalition. But we didn't have to do it that way. And I think one of the reasons that we did do it that way was, yes, the politics were easy, but also there was this sense that we can now turn it over to the science and solve the problem. So I think it's more about a mindset that we have to approach difficult problems with than a scale issue. Now, no one has. I'm very happy that no one has has mentioned the issue that's dearest to Peter's heart, which is climate change. I don't see any obstacles to thinking this way about climate change either. I think there's been a thread of kind of alternative third way policy thinking around climate change for more than 20 years that has focused on less science-based, more kind of political options-based approach. It just hasn't been the one that we chose. So I don't think scale is an obstacle. I think imagination is the obstacle.
Others here at Stanford?
Hi, Dan. My name is Dave Marvin. I'm a postdoc in the Department of Global Ecology at Carnegie Institution. My question is, as scientists, what role can we play in shifting to this paradigm from ask more science and instead ask more politics first? How can we talk about that to try to shift away from the current model?
Yeah. So part of it is well, first of all, it's difficult. Like, we're all citizens, and it's hard to know what to do, and our own behavior as individuals doesn't necessarily accumulate to community, and we're certainly stuck with certain kind of cultural views. But I think I think we all need to be more humble about what science can do in terms of delivering authoritative knowledge about some of these problems. And partly we have to recognize that politicians are very happy to shunt responsibility onto the scientific community for solving stuff, right? Because it's a lot easier than taking the risk of doing it themselves. So here I'm just imagining something, but it would be pretty cool to have a quiet period, a scientific quiet period around something like climate change, and instead simply talk about what are the stakes, what are the values at stake here, and what are the options available to us, and refuse to answer. I don't really think it's going to happen, but refuse to answer questions about what is the certainty or uncertainty of a particular thing happening. So I think engagement's really important. I think we need to be very clear that politics and science in these contested domains cannot easily be separated. Part of the problem is it's difficult for scientists, I think, to acknowledge that that in these sorts of situations we are automatically political actors. There's nothing we can do about that. That seems like a delegitimating thing to say, but my belief is that the insistence that science can maintain independence from politics is part of the problem here. It allows the political world to act as if they believe that's true in mobilizing it to advance their own interests. So I think more transparency, honesty about our own enterprise, about its strengths and weaknesses, and about our own role in portraying that enterprise would be really valuable. But it's hard to do. It's risky. It's risky to things like careers. It's risky to things like promotion and tenure. So I think it's one that's really going to have to be led by the leaders in the scientific community itself. I think we're kind of at a decision point where that really something needs to change, or this sense that science is politics by another name, I think, is going to become very, very cynically embedded in the public.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we turn back to the chat line if you could take a question.
All right. Are you suggesting consensus, a political and democratic consensus, is more important than factual empirical science? In other words, are you suggesting that the whole science is just socially negotiated, a la Chapin? Well, I do think science is socially negotiated, but that doesn't mean I don't think that there's factual ways of understanding the world. But I just think those facts only take us so far. So again, if you think about climate change, the things that we know to be true about climate change don't really tell us anything about the things that we ought to do. And moreover, they don't tell us anything even about the consequences of particular actions. So for example, the behavior of this complex socio-technical system called the global energy system is something that no one really understands. We can't predict it. We don't know how intervening in it affects the future of that system. We see grand experiments going on in places like Germany, and we don't yet know what they're going to lead to. So it's, factual empirical science is great, but it's often a lot less apparent in these domains than we might like it to be. And so I think, being clear about where we can say things that are really robust and how those things are relevant to policy dilemmas is very important. I want to make one other point about that. Oh yeah, so a lot of times the problem isn't that we don't have facts, it's that we also have too many facts. Enough in some of these rich domains that you can aggregate a set of facts to say something that's reasonably reliable and robust, that happens to also align with a particular way of looking at the world. So if you for example, I've looked at the way that different scientific communities align with different views around GMOs. And if you're an ag economist or an agronomist working on agricultural productivity, you're likely to have a very different view of GMOs than if you're an ecologist worried about gene flow and the preservation of ecosystems adjacent to GMO fields. So each of those perspectives can provide nice factual views that map onto particular sets of values. And what this shows to me is that it's not a matter of empirical science and fact, it's a matter of being clear about where we can say factual things that actually bear on our options, and where we're saying partial things that can be selected to advance particular positions. And again, in these complex systems, there's no whole view, right? There's many views. There are disciplinary views. There might be interdisciplinary views, but are still not whole. And so I don't think the problem is that there aren't empirical facts. The problem is that that there's no way to simply say this is what's going on. There's too much going on. Everyone gets their facts. Everyone has the facts that they want, or can. Should I look at another one? Let's see. What about situations where the science is almost nearly certain all the independent data lies in the same direction, such as with vaccines and autism? Is it bad to suggest the topic should be resolved politically rather than scientifically? Yes, actually, this came up in the earlier conversation today. So it's a couple of interesting things going on here. One is that in many ways, vaccines went through their period of controversy 100 or more than 100 years ago. And there was a strong social consent. There has been a strong social consensus around vaccines until reasonably recently. So I characterize the vaccine thing as what I'd say is kind of, boutique or luxury controversy. And I think it will go away if we begin to back away from vaccines significantly. You're already seeing in some communities resurgence of measles and whooping cough. Interestingly, by the way, these are not issues that are characterized by people who don't understand science. Typically, they're hyper educated communities like Boulder, Colorado, that are simply extremely risk averse. Partly, this is a consequence of the success of the technology. So I think in cases like vaccines, there's sort of a luxury to have stupid ideas about it, and I think that luxury will be taken away from us as if there's significant action to undermine reality. So this should make clear that I believe there's real things out there. I think vaccines are a wonderful example of science connected to a technology, connected to a particular outcome, where the feedbacks to society are clear. We can see that we don't have smallpox anymore, and we can see what happens when we stop using vaccines around childhood diseases that previously hadn't existed. So I think that will be self-correcting.
Great. Andy and Deborah, do we have more time for questions? Where are we on our time?
I think we're pretty much at the end of the time, but if there's another question in Stanford, go ahead.
Well, I'll throw one in if no one else does. So very quickly, Dan, the first speaker in this series this spring was Naomi Oreskes, who spoke and writes quite forcefully around the efforts by industry across a range of issues who feel threatened by the anticipation of regulation around issues where science is suggesting that may be an outcome from tobacco, obviously, to energy, to focus on uncertainty with respect to science as a weapon, as a tool in their efforts to reduce the rate at which regulation might take place. So how does that analysis, where the industry is actually using scientific uncertainty as a weapon, I would argue, or she would argue, connect to your argument about the need to take this out of a political context?
Yeah, well, it connects to it because I actually think, I mean, Naomi probably wouldn't agree with this, but whoops, anybody there?
Yes, we're still here. Go ahead.
Lost video for a minute. It shows how the issue of uncertainty can be exploited for political reasons. I would say, you know, I mean, I try to look at this from a bit of an academic distance, and what I see is that for those of us who think that that action needs to be taken on certain issues where there's uncertainty, that is simply our take that the uncertainty isn't, in fact, a reason for action. But I don't think that there's an inherent rationality to that. I think one can also say that uncertainty is a reason for inaction. That, of course, depends on one's interests and whose ox is going to be gored. You know, I think that the fact that climate change has gotten mired in these discussions of uncertainty is really an example of how we're not talking about what needs to be talked about. Why is it that that uncertainty gets to continually be kind of reasserted as the reason not to take action? Because we still are acting as if this is a question of scientific proof, as opposed to a question of political creativity and political options. Now, obviously, climate change has gotten to be such a complete political disaster over the last 20 years that it's very difficult to think about how we can back off and be more creative. Although I think it's beginning to happen now that it's fairly clear that the Framework Convention process isn't going to get us to where its advocates thought we were going to be. But I think one could easily have imagined earlier on in the climate regime a greater attention towards developing political options that would be more enfranchising of a broader array of actors than what ultimately happened. And so, you know, I think that the ability of opposition of opponents to taking certain types of actions on climate change to invoke uncertainty is simply an indication, again, that we are too dependent on the scientific aspects of the debate and not willing to back away from those and say, look, this is really about the politics, so let's talk about that instead.
Well, thank you, Dan. I think that will be the last question, and I do want to thank you. Your talk is one of those where at points I'm saying, yes, I agree, and at other points I'm shaking my head and saying, no, that can't be right, and those are the best talks, where they make you think, you know, really hard about the issues that you're presenting, and I suspect that all the people joining us are thinking hard about really difficult questions as scientists or those working in and thinking about public policy issues. So thank you very much. We can do a virtual clap without making a lot of noise. Thank you. So this was the third, as we said, in our Science and Democracy Hangout series this spring. We will hope to continue this series in the fall. Longer term, our plans are to try to create a distributed graduate seminar around these issues, and hopefully we'll be able to get that going next year sometime. But I would urge you to remain connected to the website for the Center for Science and Democracy. Look for new information about future seminars that we'll be posting, and hopefully get that series up and running next fall. So thanks everyone for joining. And Deborah, do you have any final notes for everyone?
Yes. So we would also be very interested in hearing your feedback. Don't know where my video is. Hopefully you all can see me.
Keep talking. We can hear you.
We can hear you.
Okay, that's odd. Well, I just wanted to leave an email address if you have comments or you have thoughts on future speakers or reactions to today's talk. You can send a message to Science Network, that's all one word, Science Network @ucsusa.org. So we would be very interested in your feedback. So I think that's all. If Andy and Peter, any last comments from you?
Thanks to Dan. Thanks, everybody.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.